Welcome again to the fifth episode of the Future of Architecture series, talk number 5, Agritecture. Today we will be talking to Mangaliso Mtetwa, who at the time of recording was an architect at the Gauteng Department of Infrastructure Development in Pretoria, South Africa. As a graduate from the University of Pretoria, his work focuses on mixed-use developments, residential, retail, and industrial architecture. He likes to call it simplistic complexity, blurring the boundaries between architecture and landscape. As he has demonstrated through his work, he believes that architecture has the power to change the future of the world and has a crucial role to play in the paradigm shifts that the world is experiencing. Let's find out more about what Mangaliso Mtetwa has to say on agritecture.
So, Mangi, let's get into this whole thing about Agritech. Your profile considers you to be an Agritech. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this Agritecture is about?
All right. So where the word comes from, right, is essentially a mashup of two words. So you have agriculture as well as architect. When you put them together, you guess what you get is an architect, right? So essentially what an architecture is, if I can put it that way, someone who specializes in architecture, of course, but uses landscape as well as urban designing and urban agricultural principles in order to inform the design process, as well as all the other constituents that create the architecture as well. So on my thesis, I delved deeply into the understanding of what agriculture can do for the people, as well as the economy, as well as the environment as well.
So if I had to look at agricultural principles and apply that to an architectural piece of work, that alone doesn't constitute agritecture, but really taking it into account in an urban design scheme and looking at all of the processes behind it, that would be a comprehensive understanding of what agritecture would be. Is that correct, if I understand what you're saying correctly?
No, 100%, because now when you're speaking about it, actually delves into a bit of regenerative design as well, because there's a lot you have to consider when you design, not just about the form of the building, but also the surrounding landscapes, and how can the landscape inform the design itself. So there's a lot that goes into being an architect, if I can put it that way.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense, and I think it speaks to a lot of students looking at how can we incorporate our surroundings and context into our designs in a more comprehensive, as well as some might put it, sustainable way. But we'll get to that in a short while. So if we had to just look back to your thesis, which we'll open just now in a few minutes, the problem of food production is something that you had addressed at various stages in your thesis project, Dijon. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
All right, so where do I start? At the beginning, at the middle, or so let's start at the beginning. So as I was saying, when I was doing my thesis, my master's in architecture thesis, we had to look at different issues that surround our world currently. So what I found was there's a lot of issues. So you have poverty, you have housing is one of the issues. So I was more interested in the understanding of food production. So as I delved into food production, I mean, it's such an open topic. It's an open skill. So you have to somewhat narrow it down in order to make architectural sense, and in order for me to understand what actually is food production. So I started doing the research, because when you understand food production in itself it's a value chain system. So it starts from the farmer, then it goes to the distributor, then it goes to the retailer. So there's a lot of different people that are part of that whole chain. So I had to somewhat interpret the chain in terms of the site I was working with, which was Mamelodi West, and understand what happens in terms of the food industry in that particular space. So I found a lot of things that I didn't know before I started researching. So for example, they have their own way of how they get food to site, for example. There are different spaces in Modi currently that practice the urban agricultural way of doing things. And there was just so much I learned about that. So now when I had to devise my own design, I wanted to create a space in which we can get the food production, right, from one space into the surrounding space of Mamelodi, because they don't have a lot of spaces where they can have a food production and on-site production, as well as accessibility, which was like the #1 part of the design, making food accessible to a lot of people. So that was what the angle I took in terms of the thesis, in my thesis. That's the angle I took.
So you had mentioned to me prior to this that you use agriculture and architecture, combining them as a means of facilitating social, economic, and environmental change in this particular area, which you've mentioned is in a part of Pretoria, Mamelodi.
Yeah.
So if you've used architecture and agriculture in this way to incorporate the food production system, what, in your opinion, then is architecture's role in the socio-economics of a place?
Okay, so it's okay. Let me answer it this way. So as you were saying, right? So I had to, as I said, look at food production and then look at it into like the architectural aspects of it, right? So the first issue was the food production space. So there's not a lot of spaces. So as I said, there's a bit of agriculture happening in certain spaces, but I don't think it's enough in order to feed the whole of Mamelodi. So the space there's three main functions of the building. So the first one is to just produce food. That's why I used a drip hydroponic system. I had 2 floors. So it was the ground floor, the first one, and the second floor. So on the second floor, I just wanted to produce the different types of food that you can find in the space. So I produced tomatoes, brinjals, green pepper, etc. And then on the first floor, okay, let me start with the last floor. So on the last floor, you can see a lot of light is coming in there. Because some of the plants, they need a lot of sunlight and light to grow for the hydroponic process to happen.
Right.
And then on the first floor, that's where you get your production that happens in the space. So they produce, for example, the tomatoes into different byproducts. So I mentioned tomato canned, a tomato juice, for example, all happens in that first level of the floor. And then on the last floor, which is the ground floor, that's what happens. So what you get is production on the second floor, and then the conversion into different byproducts on the first floor. And then on the ground floor, which is the retail, that's where you sell all the different byproducts. Therefore, empowering, as I said, my client, which was informal vendors. Because on the site itself, we'll get to the contextual part of it. There were 2 malls on each side. And we all know what happens when you have a mall. People tend to lose money because they cannot compete physically with a large retail, I think you could put it that way. So now what the building does, it empowers them by creating a space in which they can be empowered. They can compete competitively with any major retailer. So that's why I had to make the retail space very permeable, so people can walk around, buy the food, do all of these things inside the ground floor. So that's how I actually started to see the link between food production and architectural needs.
So I think that in showing these levels and through the section, you've very effectively communicated an entire space and how it undergoes series of transitions from the street, which is where the informal activity occurs, into becoming something more permeable and then more permanent, which is almost at its or it's at a center between these 2 anchor malls. It actually becomes a transition space, but within this transition space, you actually engage the pedestrian or the passerby.
100%. Okay, I enjoy interpreted design, which is actually quite true. That was what I intended to do. Yeah, that's a good interpretation of the design. Yeah.
So Mangi, but you didn't just do it by putting in an architecture intervention. You've done it through the means of food production, because food production is something, the end product is something everybody generally leans towards. Just say you're walking on a street and something smells pretty good, you generally gravitate towards it, you are attracted by it. But here you didn't just incorporate the final product, but you actually have the processes, which we'll get into in a short while. So I'm just stop sharing the screen there very quickly. So the next question that was or the next question I'd like to ask you is that idea that you've had now to combine agriculture and architecture. It's not a new idea per se. In fact, architecture and agriculture has always been mutually beneficial. They've always had this relationship. So how do you think this age-old partnership could take us into the future?
Okay, no, I hear you. I think it's a good question, but there's a lot of ways in which you can take that to the future. Because as I mentioned previously, going to a space, people need to learn how to create their own food, because you can see the food system itself as quite unsustainable. Because you cannot get to a space in which we find ourselves that we can't even buy food just because you come from a lower socio-economic group. So food has become part and parcel of how we live. So people learning how to grow. So that's another thing that I considered when I was designing, because you want people to understand the food process, how food grows, in order for them to start creating their own food. So that's one of the other things I mentioned as part of the thesis that you want to teach, because it's always going to be that relationship between food and people. And obviously, sometimes you might need a space in order to have all of this happening. So you're always going to find this, as you said, this long established relationship between agriculture and agriculture itself, architecture and agriculture. Sorry.
So I think I can see that through not just your building as an intervention, but I can see that you're building as an idea. It really conveys taking architecture and agriculture to a level that I could say there was a relationship, but you formalize this and you actually made it quite evident. And this is just one of the ways we can take it into the future. So if this is one of the ways, then you encountered many agricultural technologies along the way, which showed much promise toward an integration with architecture as something that's economically feasible through agriculture. Do you think that in the long term, agriculture and architecture could merge and become something that's economically viable for the profession of architecture, at least?
Okay, because at the end of the day, that question, I hear what you're saying, Akil, but I think it's quite complex, because remember, in order for us to, how can I put it? In order for us to make it profitable, we have to show the value in using agritecture, if I can put it that way, so that we can understand what it is. Because it's all about communicating value. Because some people might not necessarily understand what is the whole point of merging the two.
Yeah,
communicate the value in the project. So you have a space in which you can create all of these different types of vegetables, a space in which you can empower people, then they can start to see the value. And then the commercial profit will always come to a question of labor, the skills, the valuable space, as well as the existing networks that you find within a different context. So again, that's more of a question of understanding what's happening in that particular space, and then making it a viable solution for profit and commercial purposes.
So are you saying that perhaps there's more investigation that needs to be done into it?
No, 100%, because what I read about the thesis, right? So I was looking at my thesis after I did this, 2019. So when you read it, you see the other ways of which you can improve it. So maybe, for example, started looking at, I don't know, for the food parts, for example, that could have helped as part of the design. So design, when you release a design itself, there's always going to be something better you could have done to improve it. And hopefully, let's say I brought this table, this was my contribution, right? So the next person who's going to come will bring something completely different to the table. So maybe a continuous change, a continuous making it better.
So I think that yours was just the start of a future that we are going towards, and there is a lot of work, like you said, needs to go into it. Besides the architecture, there's a lot of economic implications as well, because if you can make people to some degree educated on food production systems, then it does cause an entire social movement, if you can call it that. People becoming more aware of the food they are creating, and even where the wastage is going, or how to at least manage that food. So which of the technologies that you've encountered do you think is the most promising within within your project that you've used, whether it's hydroponics or aquaponics? What do you think is the most promising?
Okay, so whilst I was doing my project, right, so I had to look at different ways of creating food. So as you mentioned, I went to an aquaponics center and I went to a drip hydroponics space, which was an innovation hub at the University of Pretoria. So I went to look at all the different ways in which you can understand the food processes. So for me personally, to answer your question, is that you have to look at what is the best solution for a particular space. Because remember, if you use the system, let's say, for example, you can't, let's say, use it in a high dense area, because when I was speaking to the engineer, for example, I wanted to put that huge aquaponics tank on top of the building, but it was like, that's what was quite problematic, because you're putting so much weight on the building. So again, that's one way to look at it. And then the reason why I took hydroponic system was obviously because it uses less water. And then the other thing is that or the quality of produce is better, and it can be space. Usually you need a greenhouse, and then you can start planting a different type of hydroponics. But it will be depending again on the context that you find yourself in, which will guide you in the process. But for me, I personally think that drip hydroponics is the way to go in terms of the different technologies involved in urban agriculture.
And so of hydroponics, where did you incorporate it into your building?
Okay, so what happens is that this was also another design decision I had to take. So at the beginning, I wasn't really sure I wanted to put it in terms of the building, but I had to, because the retail and the empowerment part of the ground floor was so important. I wanted to make that space permeable and for retail for the ground floor. And I said, you know what, let me just have a top-down approach, so you can produce, convert, and then consume. So that's how the concept guided me as part of the design process.
So then would you say that the hydroponics was an informant in your design? Was it a guiding principle, or was it a result of other design factors that had come into place?
Okay, because for me, as I said, it was more of understanding. It was a concept. So the concept guided me to put, and then the other things that I wanted to make sure that ground floor is for retail, because that's where you're gonna get the most foot traffic happening. So, for example, on the site, right, there's Denobom station just opposite the site. So just imagine having 250,000 people walking through the building, in and around the building, in order to buy the product, so they can empower the informal vendors that are found inside the site. So it's like, oh, that was perfect. So let me just leave the retail on the ground floor, and I leave the production space for the second floor.
Oh, okay, I see. So that the use of these technologies, like you say, was aided by your design concept. So if I had to take that or this reasoning a little bit further, and I had to try and think about the potential of architecture to integrate with agritecture the potential of architecture to integrate with agriculture, architecture and agriculture, what do you think prevents this type of thinking from becoming a mainstream approach to design? Because from everything that's being said, and even previous conversations that has been had, it sounds as though this is a very beneficial way to go. Why aren't more people doing it yet?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Akhil. So what happens is that we see in most townships, right, because of there's people that say, for example, that eat a bad diet, if I can put it that way, because the bad food, the fast food is more cheaper than the organic, the healthy food that is found in much more better locations. So another thing that my project tried to solve was the fact, if let's say, right, you cut down the money that goes into distributing the product, and then everything is found locally, then that means it's going to be a much more cheaper price. Therefore, people can afford the produce that is produced in the space. So I was like, wow, okay, that's one of the very important thing that came about when I was doing the design. So yeah, because you want to make architecture for everyone. You want to make sure that people can get quality food and you don't have to go, for example, 20 k's away. For example, the Tshwane vegetable market is usually, for Mamelodi, is around 30 k's, if I'm not mistaken. And most informal women that we're interviewing as part of the project, they had to travel all of this way in order to get the produce so they can sell back into the township. So like, let's just cut that, because going from Tshwane Veg and coming back, might as well just have the production happening in the space so you can cut down the prices and make sure that everybody gets the produce.
Okay, I think that's actually a really important outcome that you've gathered from there. So then, would you say perhaps it's maybe societal constructs that currently prevent people from taking this, or at least designers from taking this into the mainstream?
It's a lot. I mentioned remember, if let's say you have a fast food chain, you want to make sure that it's in every space that you find it there. So that's one way of looking at it. And then the other issues is that people don't necessarily understand what maybe good food is, how to grow food, which is a very important, it's a life skill. You have to learn how to grow food, what food grows in at a specific season. So there's a lot of reasons that constitute that particular reasoning for why things are there the way they are.
So do you think perhaps to push forward this movement, do you think perhaps even at a schooling level, at a very early schooling level, the idea or an understanding of food production systems should be introduced?
No, 100%. But I want to delve into the education and our education debate. But we all know at the end of the day, we have to have skills, Akil. So whether it's skills in plumbing, carpentry, knowing how to paint, knowing how to grow things, you always going to need life skills, because you'll never know what life presents to you. So maybe in the schooling system, as we just mentioned, we can start to integrate these different types of ways in which people can start to live, people can start to find other ways instead of the typical use education. They can find other ways in order for them to support themselves and to have a livelihood, if I can put it that way. So that's what I'm saying.
I see.
What I'm saying. Yeah.
So
yeah.
in skills development, which are the most essential skills that you think related to agriculture that could potentially have a positive or an impactful socio-economic outlook?
Okay, so I want to let me phrase. So what happens part of the design, right? So I also had to find out other ways in which I can create sort of not job creation, but job creation as part of the site. So can you go back to the thesis? So you can see there's a lot of food pedestrian activity happening. That's the first thing you see on the site. The reason for that was because, as I said, there's on the right side of the building itself, you find the new mall is there, as well as the train station is right on the right side. And then people move and migrate through the building. And then at the top side of the pedestrian friendly environment, the group wanted to create a space in which we have much more pedestrian economy, more pedestrian friendly environment in the whole of Mamelodi. So you have those different things happening, as well as the fact that now you have the taxi ranks, right? So you have the taxi rank, which takes up a lot of space in the building itself. So at the bottom, so the site is quite large. It was a lot of hectares. The last time, I think it's like a hectare for the whole site itself. It was a hectare. So at the side of the site, you can see a whole taxi rank. So on that taxi rank, and there's a lot of ways that we can create job creation, because for example, you can be the taxi marshal, you can be the person cleaning up, because since there's so many pedestrians walking in the space, you will need someone to clean up the space as well.
Okay.
So, and then the other important thing about the taxi rank in a South African context, the fact that they bring clients to the buildings, and they also bring the people that work in around the space, a space in which they can fulfill all the activities. So the taxi rank itself can bring a lot of job opportunities to the site. And then as you walk up, I hope you're following my arrow, but I hope you're following my arrow.
I can't really see your arrow there, Mangi, but no worries. You can maybe just zoom in a bit.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Okay, so as you're walking up the from the taxi rank, right? You walk through the building. There's also another green space, Solomon Mahlangu Square. So now you're connecting the taxi rank as well as the other spaces in and around the building itself. And then from the western side of the building, you have the informal taxi rank change station, which I wanted to leave there. So it's continuing this taxi age. So at the south side of the building, you have so much transport activity happening. So whilst I was designing, I didn't, you know, when you're designing, you don't really think of what's going to happen because you want to bring as much information, as good informed decisions as possible. So the space itself eventually became, if I can put it this way, a public transport interchange, which I was happy about because you can densify the space and bring as a lot of foot traffic into the space. So on the north side of the design, right, you have the BRT system. So the BRT brings people to the site, as well as the fact that, as I said, on the informal taxi rank, you have more taxis coming from the north side of Mamelodi down to the south side. So there's so much way of coming onto the site. So you have your trains, you have your taxis, and as well as you have your BRT as well. So the BRT system in itself can start bring employment to people in and around Mamelodi as well to bring the job creation in the space. And then lastly, in the building, as you can see, it's quite permeable as a space. There's a lot of schools inside the so that let's say the issue was when I was doing my interviews is that most informal vendors feel as if they don't have storage or spaces in which they can store all of their belongings, and you don't want your produce to rot. So we created different pods for them in these different spaces so they can store all their produce. And in all of the edges, right, we created a space in which different informal vendors from certain spaces can start to sell the different produce as well. So you didn't think about only the informal vendors work in the space, but also allow the space to allow for future people to come in order to sell. And then they have a great space in which they can conduct their businesses. So there's a lot because the building touches on the food chain itself and also touches on the existing network found in the space. But yeah, that's basically it for now. Let's continue the interview. I didn't forgot you guys were there.
No, that's good. That actually, it touches on a lot of aspects, as you said, and you've also taken this particular site as a transport node and implemented a program that could do it justice or could at least enhance the activities which occur in this area. So can you please just take us through your section and show us your section and explain how your building operates through the section as well?
Oh yeah, I think you mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation. So you mentioned there's a lot of different thresholds before you even enter the building. So as I said, on the left side, obviously this is more of the building. It doesn't cover the whole space. But on the left side of the building at the Solomon Mahlangu Square, which was a square, wasn't really busy. It was there, but I didn't see a lot of foot pedestrian activity happening. And then obviously you have your boundary edge, then you have your paving, and then you go into the Zamaya Street, which is a street that's going to be in the future be developed for BRT in the future. So you have the BRT as another boundary or a threshold, if I can put it that way. So you have your BRT on the left side. And then because the building, right, I don't want the building to sit on the edge. Let me just do this on the edge. Okay. As you can see, the building to sit on the street edge, right?
Okay.
So I can use the boundary edge to have a 5 meter, but for me, I want the building itself to give back to the community of Mamelodi. So now we have a landscape buffer before you even enter the building. So what I saw was, for example, you just arrived, let's say you use the taxi and then you arrive to the building. The taxi will drop you off there somewhere on the north side, and then you can park and then you can walk. So you're going to be greeted with this fine landscape buffer. It's a landscape buffer because it has its advantages, like for example, the noise from the street can be cancelled somehow. It can also create a microclimate in before the building itself. So now what happens is that you move into the landscape, you see people sitting, people eating, people relaxing. And so it functions as a public space, if I can put it that way. And then you move into the building, and the first thing you see when you look into this building is this large open staircase which connects all of the different floors in the building. As you continue to walk, right? So now you're in the building, you have a water garden. So you see the water garden as the water is there, and then you continue to move out of the building because now it creates sort of like an axis, right? And then you move, as I said, to the text, or you move to the other different locations in and around, because on the left side of the site, there was another medical center as well. So you can move through, go to it, or you can go to the new existing mall itself and you can go to the taxi rank. So as I was just mentioning on the site, you can see all the different thresholds, because I had to mention that in order to understand the thresholds. So you have the street edge, and then you can walk around, in and around. So like the boundary edge of the building, which was 5 meters. And then you have this landscape. So you have this nice landscape before you can walk into the building. And then just before you enter the building, you also, I think this is, let me show it on the section. The technical section, I think it shows it very well. So now you have the landscape of the left side, right?
Right.
Then as I mentioned, you have the pedestrian, which is the informal vendor interface. So just before you enter the building, you have this sort of like a street edge where you have other informal vendors there in that space. So I wanted to create sort of like a structure, because the whole building in itself is a steel structure. So I wanted to make sure that we can hang or put in structures for them so they can sell their produce just before you get into the building itself.
Okay, I should see.
Yeah, just before. And then obviously the building, and this is the building. If you just continue, I just want to go back to that other section because it communicates better.
Yeah, because this one is quite technical, but it's great to see the technical resolution, so students also have an idea of how to compose such a space.
100%. And as you can see, this is the structure of the building, right, Akil? You can see it. You're with me, right? So this is the building itself. Sawtooth roof.
Yes,
we are here now. We're inside the building, and then obviously you're gonna see that this large. Okay, let me just zoom in for you guys. You can see the large staircase there. So the whole purpose of the staircase was to connect all of the different spaces inside the building so that people can view. Let's say, for example, you're sitting there because it was a social space. I wanted people to congregate and sit there. So whilst you're sitting there on the production floor, you can have a view of what's happening on the retail. And same as when you're at the greenhouse floor, which is the second floor, you can have a view of what's going on production as well as understand what's going on in the retail space. So these are different types of thresholds that I'm speaking about as part of the design. So yeah, so we're walking now, right? We're walking. Now we are about to exit the building, right? We're about to exit the building. So the first thing you see is it's community garden. So on the space where people are walking, there's supposed to be a community garden. So let's say you see people that want to do the subsistence farming, we can start to teach people on how to create the different types of vegetables in the space. And then the next threshold is when, as I said, you walk from the new mall, the new Tshwane Regional Mall, then you walk through into the informal vendor, not the informal vendor, the informal changing station for the taxis. And then on the other side, let me go back to the bigger. Let me just go back so I can show you.
Okay.
Yeah, you see, as I say, you're speaking about the community space, right? So you can see the community, and then also you get more urban space where people can sit, public space, and relax. And then you walk towards, then either you can go get an informal taxi rank, or you move to the main taxi rank as part of the site. And then on the other side, because that whole lane is a productive landscape, so even the palette that I chose for the different plants had to be informed, it had to be productive for the space. And then lastly, before I forget, right, on this, still on the southern side of the site, you find a retention pond. So whilst I was looking at the contour sites for the site, is that it gave opportunities for bringing a retention pond because it was part of the water strategy. Because I wanted the building itself, because you also mentioned sustainability as a key as part of the design, which is quite important. So why not the building itself to be self-sustaining in terms of the water? Obviously, that's a very cool, but in essence, I wanted to have a retention pond, as well as the fact that people can gather and sit in and around the retention pond. And people from, as another thing was the retention, I will attract people, wildlife in and around Mamelodi to have a great space they can be in. So there was a lot of reasons why. But you can see there was a lot of thresholds. Obviously, some people might not get at the first time, but there was a lot of threshold manipulation as part of the design, because it was quite important that these different thresholds reach, people understand the different ways in which you interact with the building, and how you move to certain spaces in and around the building itself.
So Mangi, your project, if I can look at it as an overall, it looks like an ecosystem to me, an ecosystem of food production, an ecosystem of knowledge sharing, an ecosystem on biodiversity. I think there's a lot of you have an ecosystemic approach towards developing this building. Would that be a correct way to describe it?
100%, because I was when I was doing my master's degree, I was part of the regenerative group. So you had to find certain ways of how to regenerate the site, because the site itself was a brownfield site. There was a lot of littering happening. So you had to find a way in order to turn that negative into positive. And I can also allude to the fact that you were speaking about value, right? So just imagine in that site where all of this, there was a bit of urban decaying, all of these things happen, and then you just turn it around and create such a positive space in which people can interact with.
So Mangi, what if you could describe regeneration or regenerative design, what would you say that is?
For me, I think the simplest way to, as I just said, is just to have a space, right? You regenerate a space based on what is needed on the space. Because let's say, for example, my thesis worked at that particular site in Mamelodi in regards to food production, but maybe in a space in town, for example, you need to look at other alternative ways of how to regenerate the space. Maybe it's regeneration using different materials. Maybe it's regeneration using a different philosophy in terms of the technical aspects of sustainable design. So it will always be site specific to find the best solution for the problem.
I see. So the regenerative design is looking at specific solutions in specific instances and using the appropriate technologies at the appropriate time.
Yeah.
So
100%, 100%.
So, Mangi, I see that all of the issues that you have addressed in an ecosystemic manner have contributed to the character of the site, and the character which has now has been reinstated in the site does not only bring together community, but also is a positive space in the urban environment. And so can you tell us, maybe, is there any other future for this project? Have you pitched it to anyone yet? Is it going to become a reality?
Hey, let me be honest with you, Akil. So what happened is, right, when I was done with my thesis, I was like, perfect time. I need to pitch this idea to someone. But the issue was, I mean, we're in a pandemic. So just before I had to pitch this idea to someone, the corona thing happened and we couldn't go to see different people and pitch it to, let's say, different stakeholders within our towns. So for me, that's what happened. But hopefully it might happen, because I think it's quite in depth, the research that I took as part of the design. And hopefully something might happen, because we all want better architecture. We all want better spaces to live in. We all want to be in a space where we feel safe and secure and enjoy our lives. So I think hopefully in the future something might happen, and then just have to see what happens from there.
Mangi, I truly hope that this project does become a reality, because I think you've tackled many issues, and if we had to make this a reality, I think it will be a precedent for many other projects to follow in the realm of agritecture. Mangi, thank you very much for attending our session today. I'm going to give us all a 5-minute break so we can just gather our thoughts on all of this wealth of knowledge you've brought across, and the students are teaming to ask you some questions. And at least